In January 2026, the global tech industry was hit by a bombshell. Sony announced a joint venture with TCL to operate its TV business, with TCL taking over half the shares. This means future Sony TVs will no longer be pure-blooded Sony. Why would Sony, the pride of Japanese electronics, effectively sell itself to a competitor? And what about its long-standing title as the sales champion of high-end TVs? Many people spend big money on Sony TVs for that legendary Sony look, but did you know? The stunning screen in front of you likely has a panel from China or Taiwan, while higher-end models use panels from South Korea. This has been a long-standing pain point for Sony. Even with their superior black technology, like advanced processors and proprietary algorithms, they are essentially tuning panels made by others to achieve that signature Sony picture quality. However, the most expensive part of a TV is the panel, accounting for up to 70% of the production cost. In contrast, the screen cost for even a top-tier iPhone is less than 20%. More importantly, TV panel prices are dictated entirely by the manufacturers. As a result, for every TV Sony sells, most of the profit is captured by these upstream suppliers. Meanwhile, their Korean and Chinese rivals handle everything from the panel to the finished TV, allowing them to profit at both ends. You might ask, isn't Sony the pride of Japanese manufacturing? How could they be unable to produce a single panel? You can't blame anyone else for this. It's Sony's own fault. To understand, let's go back 40 years to the late 80s. Back then, Sony's CRT televisions were considered divine by consumers. But just then, a seemingly inconspicuous display technology was quietly emerging. LCD panels, once limited to calculators and digital watches, were being pushed by Sharp. They grew in size and evolved from monochrome to color, making them a perfect match for the booming laptop market at the time. In the 90s, the global laptop panel market was almost entirely dominated by Japanese companies like Sharp, Toshiba, and Hitachi. So, what about the industry giant, Sony? They were so confident in their CRT televisions that they looked down on LCD technology. Early LCDs had a pathetic 500:1 contrast ratio. The blacks weren't black but a dull gray. Plus, the response time was agonizingly slow at 20 milliseconds, causing motion blur everywhere. Not to mention the narrow viewing angles. If you tilted your head, the colors would shift completely. Crucially, LCDs at the time had a fatal physical flaw. Japan's most advanced 3.5 generation panel plants produced glass substrates around 37 inches. If you forced a 30-inch TV panel out of that glass, all the remaining edges would be wasted. But if you used that same glass to cut the then mainstream 12-inch laptop screens, you could reliably get 6 panels, leading to higher efficiency and lower unit costs. That is why LCD panels were dedicated to small laptop screens back then. To make large-sized panels for TVs, you had to sink a fortune into building a higher generation factory to double the panel size, which was essentially a massive money pit. Sony executives felt such poor picture quality didn't live up to the Sony brand. Rather than spending huge sums on inferior LCD panels, they preferred to keep selling highly profitable CRT TVs and bet their future on newer LED technology. But Sony didn't expect a rival to be preparing to use a brute force approach to push LCDs from small desktop screens into large living room TVs. Samsung, a company willing to do whatever it took to reach its goals. Their most ruthless move was the counter-cyclical investment strategy during the 1997 Asian financial crisis. Simply put, while competitors were tightening their belts, Samsung sold assets and cut staff to scrape together billions in Korean won to bet everything on panels and semiconductors. They not only captured the top spot in global LCD shipments in 1998 but also launched the first 5th-generation production line in 2002, cutting multiple 30-inch-plus screens from one sheet of glass at a lower cost, making high-priced LCD TVs affordable for the average consumer. Consumers suddenly realized that for a TV in the living room, thinness was king rather than just a slight improvement in picture quality. The demand for LCD TVs exploded, finally waking up a complacent Sony. In 2002, Sony rushed to launch their first LCD TV, hoping to get a slice of this booming market. The awkward part was that Sony didn't own a single panel factory at the time, eventually forcing them to source panels from Taiwan's Kaimei and Optronics. Sony soon discovered that since most of a TV's cost lies in the panel, the profits were being pocketed by the panel makers. Swallowing their pride, they turned to their arch-rival, Samsung, to form the joint venture SLCD in 2004. On the surface, it seemed Sony had finally addressed its weaknesses, But in reality, this was the final straw that would crush the company. Both companies could share the panels produced by SLCD, but Samsung possessed the vertical integration capabilities that Sony lacked. Not only did they own panel factories, they manufactured the key internal components of their TVs, resulting in much lower overall costs than Sony. The result was that every time Sony managed to launch a new TV, Samsung could release a comparable product at a lower price, successfully eating away at Sony's market share. In 2006, Samsung relied on its hit Bordeaux series of LCD TVs to officially knock Sony off its throne. But Sony's misfortune wasn't over. By the early 2010s, global panel prices collapsed and the market was flooded with cheap alternatives. Yet Sony was locked into their SLCD contract, forced to keep buying high-priced panels, effectively losing money on every unit sold. In 2011, Sony finally couldn't hold on any longer. They painfully sold all their SLCD shares back to Samsung at a loss, exiting panel manufacturing for good. The hardware king that had mastered CRT technology from the start eventually became just an assembly and branding firm, no longer able to catch up with Samsung. But did you think Samsung could just sit back and rake in the profits after beating Sony? Wrong. A competitor that truly sent shivers down their spine was already closing in. That is TCL. You might find it strange. Isn't TCL just another Chinese brand selling cheap goods? How could they possibly challenge Samsung's lead? Actually, TCL's start was not smooth. It wasn't until several years after the LCD boom, around 2007, that they followed the trend to launch their own products. Like Sony, TCL didn't know how to make the most important component of an LCD TV, the panel. However, they didn't choose to enter a joint venture like Sony. They decided to dive in and make the panels themselves. In 2009, they established CSOT and built a brand new 8.5 generation LCD panel production line. Then, while the financial crisis was devastating Taiwan's panel industry, they poached over 200 core engineers in one go. With this dream team, TCL's subsequent strategy was to strike directly at Samsung's sore spot. The most ruthless move was to copy-paste Samsung's vertical integration model. The LCD panels produced by CSOT would go straight into their own TVs. This way, they didn't have to worry about selling panels, and TV costs were kept to a minimum. But this isn't even what infuriated Samsung the most. Doesn't Samsung have the backing of the state? The state resources TCL received were even more staggering than Samsung's. The Korean government offered, at best, tax breaks, but the Chinese government went all out to give TCL an unfair advantage. No money? The government injects capital as a shareholder. No land for subsidies? The government steps in to negotiate, and even sets up the surrounding roads, water, and power for you. The result is that TCL's panels can crush rivals with ultra-low prices, pushing even Samsung to the brink. In 2020 alone, their LCD business lost over $1 trillion. Samsung decided they were done, announcing that year they would gradually shut down LCD production lines to focus on the higher tech, more profitable OLED. The first to successfully apply this tech to large-screen TVs was Samsung's Korean rival, LG. Since 2013, their OLED TVs have been winning awards year after year at the CES Consumer Electronics Show. Soon, in 2022, Samsung officially launched their QD-OLED TVs, and the market response was astonishing. Just 1 year later, Samsung's OLED TV market share surged from a negligible 3% to nearly 23%, and by 2025, they had captured over 30% of the market. Seeing Samsung play this game, TCL grew envious. They wanted to enter the high-end market to shed their cheap label, but if they made OLED TVs, they'd have to buy panels from Samsung or LG. Wouldn't that just hand their fate over to their enemies? So, TCL decided not to do OLED, but instead develop an improved version of LCD, Mini LED. Simply put, they replaced the backlights in LCD TVs with tens of thousands of tiny Mini LED beads, each the size of a sesame seed. This allows the TV to control the brightness of the picture with extreme precision, offering image quality that rivals OLED, while leveraging existing LCD supply chains to keep costs at an absolute minimum. With this cost advantage, TCL launched a price war, selling high-end TVs at mid-range prices. As a result, their market share in the high-end segment soared from 13% to 19%. Although TCL could now go toe-to-toe with Samsung in terms of sales volume, people still felt a Samsung TV looked more prestigious at home, which is exactly what frustrated TCL the most. To complete the final piece of their brand value puzzle, they set their sights on the gold standard brand, Sony. At the time, while Sony's TVs were still famous, global shipments had fallen to about 4.1 million units, with their market share plummeting to 1.9%. Rather than continue bleeding, it was better to focus resources on their more profitable PlayStation and mobile image sensors. One wanted to buy brand prestige, the other wanted to sell a burden. You could say both got exactly what they needed. Thus, in early 2026, TCL and Sony announced a joint venture to take over Sony's TV business. Operations are expected to begin in 2027, with TCL leading production and sales, while Sony handles design and retains its iconic logo. This major move is clearly targeting Samsung. Analysts estimate that with this joint venture, TCL's global market share will surpass Samsung's in 2027, ending Samsung's 20-year reign. Seeing this, don't you feel like this script is just a replay of history, with Samsung once replacing Sony? Because the TV industry is essentially a brutal war of attrition. No matter how bright your display or how strong your sales are, only those who can crush costs to leave competitors breathless will survive. This actually touches on what matters most to us when buying a TV. Is it the brand or the value for money? So, would you rush to buy a Sony TV before the joint venture officially starts, to collect the last batch of pure blood, Sony, or would you rather wait for this merger to bag a bargain? Leave your comments and